My name is Sheila Jordan Cunningham. Today's October 22nd, 2001. I'm in Memphis, Tennessee to interview Judge Odell Horton, Sr. This interview is taking place as part of the Legal History Project for the Tennessee Bar Foundation. Judge Horton, I'm looking forward to talking with you this afternoon. I wonder if you could start by telling us, for the record, your full name and your date of birth and where you were born.
My full name is Odell Horton, Sr. My date of birth was May 13, 1929, and I was actually born at Whiteville, Tennessee, but my home, where I grew up, is Bolivar, Tennessee. It's about 60 miles from here. I was born at Whiteville simply because my father took my mother to Whiteville because there was a doctor there who would deliver babies, and he would not charge very much. So I was born in Whiteville and went back to Bolivar when my mother did within the week after my birth.
So you spent your childhood in Bolivar?
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about your childhood and what you remember.
Well, we were probably among the poorest of the poor in Bolivar. My father died early when he suffered a heart attack, and thereafter died and left my mother really a single parent. And there were 5 children in the family, and my mother and father. My mother took in washings and laundering for people in the community. We picked cotton, chopped cotton, stacked lumber. We just did all sorts of labor work. My mother did work as a maid as well, and the end result is that's how we made a living and grew up.
What were your parents' names? My
father's name was Odell Horton. He, for years, worked at Western State Hospital there at Bolivar. The position was called tenant. My mother also worked there, and it was called tenant. And they would have to get up around 4 o'clock in the mornings, and they would leave us with a lady who would keep the children, us being the children in the family at that time, my brother and I. And then they would walk about 3 miles to work and then walk back, and it was an unusual kind of endurance that they had, really.
Tenant, that was the mental health hospital. What did it mean to be a tenant?
A person who helped take care of mentally ill people and cared for them pretty much the way people take care of folk in nursing homes today. Western State Hospital was something of an old folks' home for many years. It was a big employer in that community, and it hurt the community a lot when it was finally pretty much closed down.
Did your parents grow up in Bolivar? Your grandparents from there?
Now, I don't really know. I asked my uncle, who died last year, he was 86, where did your father, my grandfather, grow up? Where did he come from? And he said, we don't really know, but we think he came from North Carolina. My grandmother, we think, was born there in the Hardeman County area. She was born in 1863. That's what's on her tombstone. And her name was Agnes Lake Horton. And basically, that's about all we knew. They never really talked about their backgrounds, and it was something we could not get them to open up and tell us really much about. I think they were at the end of slavery, and it was bitter and not easy, and they just didn't talk about it much.
Were there other influential adults in your childhood that you remember?
Oh, yes. One of the most influential was a Dr. James Herbert White. He was principal of Allen White High School at Whiteville, Tennessee. Now, here's where we have to understand that elementary school for black children is at Bolivar, Tennessee, grades 1 through 9. Then high school, 10 through 12, was at Whiteville, Tennessee. So we rode the bus back and forth every day. It's about 12 miles. And Professor White took a great interest in me. Why, I don't know. It was he who first mentioned Morehouse College to me. I had not been that much of a student because we had to work so much. We really didn't have much time for study, and often my brother and I got to school late every morning because we had to pick up laundry, take laundry. We did a lot of fishing. We caught more fish, I guess, than anybody in Bolivar. And my wife always kids me that we passed her house every day, but we never offered to give them a fish.
Professor White was at your high school?
Yes. Now, at the elementary school, there was a Professor Lorenzo Miller, who's still living. He's about 97 to 98 years of age. And another teacher was a Professor Ned Rawls. He is now dead. And there was another teacher named Mrs. Evelyn Bills. These were people who influenced me, and another named Mattie Lou Combs. She was my elementary school teacher, first grade. And these people all had a direct influence upon me.
And the time period that you were in elementary school would have been the late 30s, early 40s. Was education segregated at that time?
Deeply segregated. In fact, one of the things that I think about a lot is that for black children, school started in July, and then school would be out in August for black children to pick cotton, and then school would start up again probably early November, and then you'd have to start all over again. But the difference was that white children were never out. They did not have this kind of recess. And in our schools, we didn't have a library. Teachers did the best they could. So many times they used their meager salaries to purchase things they needed for the classroom.
All your teachers were black at that point?
Yes, yes.
You mentioned that in high school you were at Allen White High School?
Yes.
What did you do in high school? Did you have time for athletics or?
No. We never participated in athletics, and in fact, that is one of the subjects my mother discussed shortly before she died, that she had a regret that her children did not have an opportunity to participate in many things that other children participated in, because she was a single family mother and required her children to help her in so many ways.
Tell me about your brothers and sisters.
The brother next to me, his name was named Sidney. Sidney went into the Army at about the age of 14. It was unthinkable that he would be admitted, but surely as the sun rises and sets, the recruiter did recruit him, and he went off to the Army. And we thought he would be coming back home, but lo and behold, what came back was his clothes rolled up and tied up. He spent 28 years in the Army. He won a battlefield commission in Korea to second lieutenant, and then he advanced to the permanent rank of major. He had the reserve rank of lieutenant colonel. He won the Silver Star, which is the nation's third highest award. He won a Bronze Star, had oak leaf clusters, and but he died at age 50. He was severely wounded, and he just never did really overcome it. Plus, there was a tremendous mental change in him after his Vietnam experience. Now, the brother next to him, who's named William Horton, we call him Reverend Joe, he still lives at Bolivar, and he's 65 years of age, and he retired after 20 years in the Army, and then he worked for a long time at the Naval Air Station here as a civilian employee. And then the brother next to him was named, no, my sister came in, her name was Clara Ann Horton. She was a school teacher there in Bolivar. She earned a bachelor's degree at Tennessee State and then a master's degree from Memphis State. And she taught in the Bolivar schools for many years, but she was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer and she died at age 48. My brother Max lives in Texas, and he's the only one in the family that's really healthy up to now.
It's an amazing number of degrees from 5 children who grew up working very hard during their childhood and not coming from an educated background. What do you think influenced all of you to go further in school?
I think it was a desire to please our mother and to fulfill a dream that she had that her children would do well. And she never talked to us about working hard, but by example, we learned from her to work hard. And all of us are very, very hardworking people. Even today, on senior status disability, I spent a lot of time working in my yard, and my wife got so upset about it that she hired a man to come and help me dig holes, and I can do the rest.
In school, what were your high school? What did you excel in? Or
actually, I didn't excel in anything until I reached the 11th grade, and Professor White put me in his class in English literature, and he said, "You're going to sit here and you're going to come up front and you're going to be with me." I made a grade of, I believe, A. And then after that, he said, "I want you to enroll my botany class." And I excelled in that class. And it was his confidence in me, along with that of my mother, that really made a difference in my life.
After you left high school, you decided to join the military. I know you had 2 different stints in the military.
Yes. In 1946, I entered the United States Marine Corps as a volunteer, and I went to a place called Montford Point, which was part of Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. But Montford Point was where the black Marines were stationed, and sometimes now you hear General Colin Powell talk about the Montford Point Marines, just like you hear talk about the Tuskegee Airmen. But it was basically that kind of thing. All the officers' command structure was white. It was basically an infantry training, artillery, heavy artillery training facility, but it was a boot camp. In those days, boot camps were 16 weeks. Now I understand it's 12. And I have a friend who was with me who lives at Bolivar, and he has had a stroke. And I called him up to tell him if he could successfully complete 16 weeks in a Marine Corps boot camp, he sure could conquer this thing as small as a stroke.
So it was very difficult and challenging boot camp.
Very, very, very. The training was intense. It took a lot of drills, carrying all the equipment, firing line training, different firearms, and it was very intense.
What led you to join the Marines at that age?
To help my mother. She just needed help, and my primary motivation, I think that of my brother next to me, was the same. As both of us thought this would be a way to be helpful to her and also find a way to get out of Bolivar, a little rural town, and find a way to perhaps try to make a better life for yourself.
Had you done any traveling before joining the Marine Corps?
No, I'd only traveled as far as Memphis.
Tell me a little bit about the drill instruction in the Marine Corps and whether your officers, at that time you've said the Marines were segregated, what the leadership structure was. Was it white? Was it black? Did you have any interaction with any of the white military leadership?
No, we didn't have interaction with white officers who were the commanders in charge, unless one was involved in, say, a court-martial for a particular offense. All of the drill instructors were black, and they were very severe people. And I learned how to adjust to severity, and my mother always thought I was such a nice fella that I would never make it, but it did. And today I find myself looking back, wishing that really, while my children have done well, I would have even been happier if they had had to serve in the military. And in fact, a while back, several years back, the Commandant of the Marine Corps invited some Marines who had been out of the Marine Corps for more than 25 years to visit Parris Island, South Carolina, and spend 2 days observing training there at the base. And I did go, I did participate, and they'd made some changes. One is a second lieutenant was with every platoon, and no DI could put his hand on a recruit. And then the other thing that was a bit surprising to me was the large number of women who were training right along with the men in many areas in the Marine Corps.
Do you think that's been an improvement to the Marine Corps or not?
I think it has been. Marine Corps training has always been very, very difficult, and for good reason, because Marines are trained as amphibious landing forces. They go into places often before other forces do. And I think sometimes that when I hear the reports on the news about these forays by hit-and-run commando units in the war in Afghanistan, I think perhaps many of them are probably Marines. Marines are well-trained people, highly disciplined people.
Now, you left the Marines to go to Morehouse College.
Yes.
What led you to choose Morehouse?
Well, as I told you earlier, Dr. J.H. White, my principal at the high school, had suggested to me that Morehouse is a school you should go to. I'd never heard of Morehouse. I knew nothing about Morehouse. But he knew the president there, Dr. Benjamin E. Mays. He knew the dean of the institution. And he just recommended to them that I be admitted as a student at Morehouse. And I received a letter that I had been admitted, and I could show that to my commanding officer. And the Marine Corps had a policy, as I say, that if you finished a year honorably, then, and if you show evidence of having actually been admitted to a college, you could get an honorable discharge. I complied, I received the honorable discharge, and went to Morehouse College. But the unique thing is in there, I got out of the Marine Corps in 1951, and then Evie and I got married, and then I went off to Howard University Law School while she stayed and she taught school. We grew up together at Bolivar. She is also a native of Bolivar.
Now, Evie is your wife, right?
Yes.
Evie Randolph Horton, is that correct?
That is correct.
And you two were childhood sweethearts?
Yes, if you can call it that. It was off and on. It was hair pulling, the things that country boys do when they play with girls.
You and Miss Horton have been married now since
48 years.
48 years.
Yes.
Let's go back to Morehouse for just a moment.
Okay.
How did you decide what you wanted to study at Morehouse?
Well, when I went to Morehouse, I was impressed with my English literature class in high school. And I decided that I would enroll in the English major program. But I didn't have to do that until the third year because Morehouse is a liberal arts college, and the first 2 years carry prescribed courses. You don't have much of a choice. You take these courses, such as arithmetic. They don't call it that. They call it algebra and geometry. physical education, basic science, and courses like that. And you take the 2-year basic curriculum first, and then after that you then choose a major subject. And I chose English and political science. At one time I thought I wanted to be a doctor. That was what my father thought I ought to do, and I took enough biology courses to actually have almost a major, but I found out I didn't want to dissect frogs and all that. So I went and I stayed in the literary field. I joined the debating club. I joined a club called Men and Books. Met many authors while I was there, like Pearl Buck and Lillian Smith, who wrote lavishly on social matters. And we'd have an opportunity to meet with them in seminars, visit homes of Lillian Smith way up in the mountains in Georgia. And it became rather fascinating to me, plus the fact I had always been a reader. I have read all of my life. No one ever told me to read. Somehow I just developed a tremendous desire to read. And women who worked in homes as maids would bring me magazines that were discarded, and I would read through those magazines. And I have read all of my life. In fact, I still read, but now that I'm out of the law, I'm reading some books that I have wanted to read for many years, but I've never had an opportunity to do so. And for example, right now, I'm reading Nora Neale Hurston's book, Their Eyes Were Watching God. And then I'm also reading a book that Dr. Douglas M. Bailey, the rector at Calvary Church, recommended, Christ Before Christianity. And these are fascinating to me because I've been to Jerusalem and to the Holy Land. And I studied the life of Christ as really a real point of interest now. And at 72, I can tell you, when you go to funerals of people who are younger than you, or people that you have been associated with for many years, and you see them dead, Lord knows it puts it on your mind. And so I want to come to terms with my own spirituality and be at home and free with my concept of Jesus. Mm-hmm. And I am a believing Christian, but I'm also a practicing Christian.
Am I right in thinking that at one point your mother wanted you to be a minister?
Yes, it's my grandmother.
Grandmother? My
grandmother felt like if you didn't become a preacher, you were a misfit in the world. And that's because from the earliest time that I can remember, our church was a small rural Baptist church. The women sat on one side, which was called the mother's corner. The men sat on another side, and it was called the fathers, the deacon's corner. And and the platform was right between the two, and the pulpit's in the middle, and she kept me at her feet for years. And I listened to all these preachers, and I got so indoctrinated with religion, and she just knew that I was going to be a preacher. But I really didn't want to be a preacher.
Well, how did you slip off the narrow path into law?
Well, there were some reasons why. Number one is I, on Saturdays, shine shoes in a barber shop there at Bolivar, and did fairly well for a little town like that. If you made $5 a day or something like that, it was quite a bit. And one of the people who showed up every Saturday for a shoe shine was a lawyer named Bert Hodge. And I would shine his shoes, and he would say, what are you going to do with your life? He'd talk to me like that. And at the end of the time, he would pay me 25 cents. And he was a very well-dressed man. So I just wanted to be like him. and the law settled them. I did not know a lawyer. I had a black lawyer. I'd never seen a black lawyer. I'd heard of Thurgood Marshall and another black lawyer in Nashville named Z. Alexander Luby, but I had never met any of them. But at any rate, he was a great encouragement. And then another reason was that one morning about 5 o'clock, the sheriff of our county brought a lot of deputies and raided our two-room house searching for illegal liquor. And my father had a great deal of courage, and he would confront the sheriff and say, "Show me your warrant. Show me the warrant. You should have a warrant. If you're going to search my house, you're supposed to have a warrant." The sheriff never said anything to him. And he said, "Just show me the warrant." And he just kept following him around. And I thought, I look back on it, back in those days, black people didn't have much right. And police brutality was almost a way of life. And but the sheriff would just walk away from him. And he would follow him and say, "Show me the warrant. Where's the warrant?" Finally, the sheriff just told all his people, "Let's go." And they left. And that left a tremendous impression upon me. And then a third reason was that my friend who had a stroke, his name was Jeff Eddie McKinney, Jr. We came down here during our senior year because we had a job working for a company that was putting sod somewhere on the bank of the Mississippi River. And we came down here with this crew, and we were given what's called a tamp. And it weighed about 10 pounds, and people put down the sod, and you come along, tamp the sod down tight so that it would grow. Well, that got to be a job that was extremely difficult for us, and we just decided that we'd better look another place because, first of all, life in the camps was unique for us, and some of these people were people that we couldn't understand their way of life. But at any rate, we walked from somewhere here along the river to Beale Street and went into some of these Beale Street places and begged for money to get money to buy our tickets back to Bolivar, and did get it. And while we were sitting in the Trailways bus station, some Memphis police officers and a Navy shore patrolman came through checking tickets, and if the person was asleep, he would kick him on the front of the leg and checking tickets. And this particular man indicated to this officer, he said, "Please don't kick me on my leg this way." And just out of the blue, the man hit him with a blackjack just above his eye and just knocked him down on the floor. They kicked and stomped him and took him by the belt behind and just drug him out. And that was an experience that is just like being branded upon your brain. You never forget. In fact, my friend that Bolivar frequently asked me, "Do you remember that?" And these three things, I think, had a lot to do with shaping the direction that I thought I should go.
I imagine at this time the police officers and the sheriff's officers were all white, and
yes,
the man who was beaten was black.
Black, he was, right. And there was really nothing you could do about it.
So you got to Morehouse and you majored in English. Did you know at that point you wanted to go to law school?
Yes, I had made up my mind about going to law school, and I had, at Morehouse, Morehouse brought a lot of people in to lecture to us, and every Tuesday morning was a chapel morning in which a visitor would come to speak. And that was a very well-known lawyer in Atlanta named A.T. Walden. And then he was Democratic. And another person named John Wesley Dobbs, he's the grandfather of Mayor Jackson of Atlanta. They would come through and have these great debates for us and others. And we got to know and see and hear lawyers argue and present their points of view. And of course, they did it with great eloquence. In that day, public speaking eloquently carried with it a high respect. And we liked what we heard, and so we went to Lowe's. I said, this is it for me.
Were you active in the civil rights movement at that point?
No, only well, one thing I did in law school was that when Emmett Till was murdered in Mississippi, I did chair a committee of law students and encouraged every law student at Howard Law School to buy a individual membership in the NAACP, and we almost got 100% participation in that. That was the extent of it. And then, of course, the other part of it came after I became a lawyer and I was here in Memphis.
Before we get to Howard and to your law school career, let's jump back a minute. After you finished at Morehouse, you joined the military again.
Yes. After I graduated from Morehouse, I had been home, I guess, maybe 2 weeks, and I get a notice from the draft board to report to the old Kennedy Hospital, which was here in East Memphis. I think WKNO occupies that property now, at least a large part of it, and for a physical examination and for induction into the armed forces. And I was a bit surprised, but I did come down here on a bus from Bolivar, and I went through the day-long examination there, and I was placed in a section where it was a group over here on your left and another group on the right. So if you were on the right, you were 4F, you could go home. You weren't going to go in the military. But if you were over on the left, you were a candidate for the military. And at the end of the day, when most of these examinations had been completed, an officer, a Marine officer, came through, and there were 2 Marine MPs with him, and they were yelling, "Odell Horton." And I looked at them because, number one, I wasn't all that encouraged about raising my hand because I didn't know what they wanted. And number two, I just felt like it must be somebody else in that room named Odell Horton. So they kept calling the name, and finally this officer says, "I know there's somebody here named Odell Horton." And what I did was I raised my hand, and I said, "Well, I am a Odell Horton. If you're," he walked up to me and he said, "What is your serial number?" Well, this went back to my first enlistment in the Marine Corps. And I told him, 629774. He said, "Come with me. You're not going to the Army. You're going back to the Marine Corps." So I went back, and I spent 2 years more in the Marine Corps.
So after having served once and been honorably discharged, you were drafted for the second time.
That is correct.
And this time you had an experience at the Navy School of Journalism that you thought was...
Yes, at first I was in the boot camp. They cut all my hair off and all the things that the Marines do to start you out brand new and participating in all the things that they think you ought to do and getting your mind regulated, And after about 2 weeks, I was called in, and the adjutant, I was in what's called the 7th Recruit Training Battalion. The adjutant said to me, "There's no use in you going through boot camp twice, and we have decided to remove you from boot camp, and we're going to give you a job here in this office." And that job was making out identification name tags for other Marines. Easy work compared to boot camp training. And I did that for a while. And then I started getting an interest in journalism because I went to the library at the Marine Corps. It was a Quonset hut. There's nobody but me, so it was a quiet place to go. But they had the congressional record and all these things you could read. And I'd either do that or go over to the chapel where there were talented people who played Bach and Beethoven. I'd listen to that. Some of them were very, very good. And I decided to apply for admission to the Navy Journalism School at Great Lakes, Illinois. And my adjutant turned me down. The commander of our company, a lieutenant colonel, he turned me down. It went up to the commanding general's office, and I'll never forget, his name is Mervyn H. Silverthorne, a major general, and his office turned me down. And so I just assumed that, that was the end of the day. But out of the blue, a Marine Corps aviator that I had never seen, and I don't know how he knew about my letter and my application, and he said, "Are you the Marine that applied for the journalism school?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, did you know you could apply for an appeal to the Commandant of the Marine Corps?" I told him, "No, sir." He said, "Well, you can." And he said, "I want you to write a letter of appeal, and I'll be back through here tomorrow night, and I'll look at your letter, and I'll make some corrections on it if I think appropriate." He did come back. He did make some corrections. Then he said, "Retype it, mail it." I did. And about 3 months later, out of the blue on a Friday afternoon, a lot of people were looking for me, and I learned from the adjutant that I was going to the Navy Journalism School at Great Lakes, Illinois. Now, this was a joint armed services school, Army, Navy, Coast Guard, Air Force, and so forth, Marine Corps. And the basic requirement was a journalism degree. Well, I didn't have a journalism degree, but I had worked on the student newspaper at Morehouse. I had been in the literary club, the debating club. So somehow all of that was put together, and it came out sufficiently for me to be admitted to the journalism school. There were 35 of us in the class. I worked harder, I think, than most people there because there were so many ambiances at Great Lakes, that could attract attention. But I decided that I would put my time on the school, and I completed the 16-week course, 5 out of 35 people. It was great. I first actually learned how to write an English sentence well. You've heard me say that before.
I have, and I've heard you say that helped you later in your opinion writing.
Exactly, exactly.
So when you finished your second tour in the military, you came back, and at that point you ended up at Howard Law School.
Yeah, but I got married first. Evie and I got married, and we had been sort of courting for about 8 or 9 years, and the amazing thing is both sides of our family felt like it was time for us to do something. And so we did get married, and I went on to law school, and Evie taught school at Covington, Tennessee. And then thereafter, at the end of the year, she came to Washington and joined me. And she got a job as a clerk in a laundry. And then thereafter, I got a job as a clerk in the general accounting office and working with figures, because she's very good with figures. And the end result is that we worked hard, we worked together, we kept our goal. She made a sacrifice for me, and that is that she gave up it was not an opportunity, but she gave up a chance, I'll put it, to earn an advanced degree at Howard University so that I could stay in the law school. And I appreciated that, and I went to the library. Law school classes were always over at noon, and I went to the library at 1 o'clock, and I stayed until 9 o'clock, and I did that every day that I was in law school for 3 years. And we started with a class of 60-some people, and I graduated, I think, number 10 or 11 out of 29 in our class. So I had to work hard, and and now she's very happy that she made that sacrifice, because life is beautiful, and she's very pleased, and she likes to hear people say I treat her like a princess. Well, she drives a Lexus automobile and often goes to Honolulu, her favorite city. But now, since September 11th, she won't get on a plane. She will not do it, won't go. I said, well, somewhere, somehow, we'll get there again.
Had she finished her college education when she moved, when you were married?
Oh, yeah, she had earned a Bachelor of Science degree at Tennessee State University. And when she came down here, She taught 12th grade home economics at Wooddale High School for 22 years, and she retired from Wooddale High School after total teaching years of 36 years, because she had taught at various other schools. They shift teachers around. But once she went to Wooddale, that became a permanent teaching position, and she enjoyed it. And I'm amazed at how many people who meet with her now in shopping centers and on the street and want her to meet their grandchildren.
Let's circle back again to Howard. What made you choose Howard University for your law school?
Well, there weren't, at that time, where else could you go? We had heard that people could go to places like Columbia, Harvard, or something like that, but that was just out of our reach, and Howard was the place where most black students interested in the law went. But it turned out to be a great blessing because we saw the lawyers there that we'd never heard of. And anytime the lawyers had cases before the Supreme Court of the United States, all of the law students would be assembled to listen to their arguments, critique their arguments, and they would always say, no matter how stupid it might sound to you, ask it anyway. And here's where I saw people like Thurgood Marshall, Constance Baker Motley, some other folk at Robert Carter. Most of them became federal judges after that. But this is where I really got an opportunity to learn a great deal about the law. And there were white judges who would come. There was a judge from Mississippi who was on the district court there named Bernita Shelton Matthews, I believe, from Mississippi. She would come, and we would visit her court. And we saw people like George E.C. Hayes, who had tremendous reputations in the criminal law field. And it was just an across-the-board kind of thing. And it was a rich experience, way beyond a classroom experience in the law. So I'm glad I went to Howard. Now, since that time, and sitting on the federal court where you go to seminars every year, I've had an opportunity to go to the University of California at Berkeley, like we would go for whatever time, 2 weeks. We spent 2 weeks at Harvard, and you go to these various places for seminars for advanced training. It added to your awareness and constant keeping up with developments in the law and seeing some very outstanding people. Because one morning in the Harvard cafeteria, I was sitting there and eating a breakfast, and a man sitting next to me was reading a newspaper. It was Archibald Cox. So it was just that kind of experience. Now, it didn't mean a thing to Mr. Cox, but for a boy like me from Bolivar, Tennessee, who came up the way I did, it was everything. It meant everything. It was awesome.
After Howard, was it difficult to come back to Memphis to practice law?
It was very difficult, very difficult. Yeah. Even I went to Chattanooga, just sort of trying to survey what might be available, and there was nothing there. And we decided that we would just go to Memphis. And the reason we decided Memphis is because Memphis was close to Bolivar. So if all went bad, we could get back home. And I came down here and rented a room that's on top of the B.B. King restaurant here at 145 Beale Street now. And I had one room up there. It was rented to me for $20 a month. And I just did whatever legal work I could find. And it wasn't anything about upscale legal things. It was the kind of things that little people had that required mostly somebody to read it to them and notarize it. But I was out there from 1957 to 1962. And I often wondered, how did I make it? I don't know. But Evie did teach school, and that provided an opportunity for me to continue. And we had faith. And my children today cannot believe that I walked from Orange Mound to Beale Street and back many a day because I didn't have car fare to spare. And the amazing thing is, one never had to worry about anybody bothering you. Crime wasn't that of that nature. The biggest thing you had to worry about is hoping it didn't rain while you were walking along.
And that would have been about 4 or 5 miles?
Probably about 4 miles, yes. But I was used to it. I walked a great deal as a child. And just about everywhere we went, we walked. So it didn't seem to be a challenge to me.
Now you read so much about lawyer advertising and how lawyers are supposed to go out and market themselves and get clients. How did you try to get business when you were practicing?
Well, you could not market at that time. That was against the rules of ethics of the profession. But I would stand there at Second and Beale, and I would just hand out business cards. I'd hand out business cards. And then later on, Dr. Charles F. Pinkston had a duplex, and he had a dental office on one side. And he said, if you want to take the other side, you can have it. $20 a month will be fine, whatever you want. So I moved out in Orange Mound, and I met a Mr. M.J. Edwards Sr., who operated a funeral home called Victory Funeral Home. And I sent out cards in the mail to folk, you know, and one day, out of the blue, he came to see me. And I was complaining to him about how difficult it is, and it didn't look like one could do too well here if you were black. And he said to me, you know what, just get yourself something going. And if you get something going, and that something is big enough and attract enough people, others will come to see what you're doing. And I followed his advice. So I went to a small church there in Orange Mound, and I had studied religion at Morehouse. I was always fascinated with religion. And I went over to that Wednesday night Bible class, and they only had 4 or 5 people. And eventually they asked me, would you teach our class? And I did undertake to teach that class. Well, that class grew within a year to where we had more than 75 people coming on Wednesday night. So many, they had to move it out of the basement up to the auditorium of the church. And I taught that class for about a year and enjoyed it much. The end result is I was slowly but surely becoming known in the community. And out of that, I would get people to say, can you get a divorce for me? Can you handle an adoption for me? And it just sort of grew that way, but never anything big. It was just what it was. And one day I was standing in the doorway at 145 Beale, and I saw this caravan with President John F. Kennedy here when he visited Memphis, and it was a convertible automobile. And I looked at him, because it went by so fast you couldn't hardly get much of a view. But it just amazed me. How could a man look like that? How could a man's color look like that? You know, how could this be? But it wasn't long after that my career changed.
Did you know other black lawyers in Memphis at that time?
Yes, there were some other black lawyers here. Reverend Ben Hooks was a lawyer who was here. A lawyer named Ben F. Jones was here. A lawyer named James F. Estes was here. He was a major in the Army, and he had a law office here. There was a lawyer named Shepardson Wilburn here. He became a circuit court judge. He died some time ago. And A.W. Willis was a lawyer here, and Russell Sugarman was a lawyer here. And in the Civil Rights Museum now, there is a photograph of all these lawyers, along with Art Shea, who was the assistant city attorney prosecuting these sit-inners. We were there to defend. And years later, Art Shea said to me, he said, you know, I've often thought about my experience here. He said, all of you became judges. All I got out of it was a heart attack. But one of the fascinating things, and a kind of an ironic thing, was that I had a law clerk who took a maternity leave. And I invited Art Shea to serve as a law clerk for me on a temporary basis. He'd retired. And Mrs. Ann Bro, who was my courtroom case manager, had suggested that, why don't you ask him? And he said yes. And he worked 8 weeks for me, and it was just wonderful. We had a great experience. He said, now, you never would have believed this would have happened in 1968, would you?
Did you and the other black lawyers in town, what kind of role did you play in defending the sit-ins and the demonstrations during the...
Well, we were all pretty much individualists, with the exception of Hook, Sugarman, and Willis. A.A. Ladding was a senior lawyer here, but Mr. Ladding did not participate in the civil rights movement in any legal way, but he was always available for advice and counsel. We would just get together and decide that we would go as a group, and whatever happened to one would happen to all. But one of the things that, in looking back at it, was that no police officer ever got in the way of black lawyers. Never did. And we had heard the word came down from Commissioner Claude Armour. They represent their clients, and you are to respect that. And years later, when police director, police chief, I called him then, Henry Lux, became very ill and he died. His wife called me one day and she said, I have to tell you, you'll never know how much he admired you. Isn't that wonderful?
That is wonderful.
Yes.
That is wonderful. This would have been during what period of time, Judge?
These sit-ins occurred in 1968 and to some extent in 1969, but it was in the year of the sanitation strike. And at that time, in 1969, I served with Mayor Loeb as Director of Hospitals and Health Services in the city of Memphis. Well, as soon as I got there, 1,400 black people went out on strike. And that strike lasted 55 days, and we negotiated with the union, the AFS-CME, American Federation of State, County, Militia Employees.
I'd like to talk... the city attorney, Frank Giannotti, and I negotiated with them. And he was a very quiet, easygoing, very nice person to work with. And over those 55 days with 1,400 people, a lot of noisy meetings and that sort of thing, but we never had a single incident of any kind. That was a fascinating job that you held. I'd like to get back to that in a second. Let me go back and pick up something that I think I skipped. And I wanted to ask you, when you came to Memphis back from Howard to start practicing law, you had to sit for the bar exam. And I know you've told me the story of taking the Tennessee bar exam. Yeah,
I got a relative to bring me to the old Goodwin Institute building where the bar exams were given at that time. And you went upstairs to whatever floor, and I went in, and you had a letter or something that indicated that you were a candidate. And I was handed a number of blue books. A number was written on those blue books with some tablets, and I was told that it would be 2 days, mornings and afternoons, and at the end of each session you would turn your tablet in with your number on it. And I sat there and all these white applicants, and so I had a seat in the back and I took my bar exam. But I had been tutored. I could not get into a bar examination, bar study course here. And I was told at the old Southern Law School before it's in Memphis State University Law School, we cannot meant colored at that time. You know, black people have gone through many names. We've had Negro, colored, Afro-American, you just name it. But at that time, we were colored. And they said, we cannot accept you. And then I think I made a plea later on if they would rent me the notes. I believe they may have done that. And then my mother did some washing and laundering for a lawyer at Bolivar named Harry Boyd Denton. And Mr. Denton told her, oh, don't tell Odell, don't worry about it. I will help him. And I'll tell you, it was a blessing from heaven, because that man tutored me for 6 months. I followed him around. I went to court with him. I was in his office, had half his books at my house. And he would drill me. Let's go over this again. I don't think you got this right. I don't believe you understand this. Let's do it again. Let's go over it again. Let's write it out. And he was just great at that. And he said that, I think you're ready. And when I took the bar exam down here, at that time, you didn't get your notices published on computers, and you didn't get your notices published on Saturday evenings before then the results were made public and that sort of thing. It just came out in the newspaper. And my mother and I would get a newspaper every Sunday morning, a commercial appeal. And I was a reader, so she always wanted me to read the paper. And when I turned it over and it said bar exam results, and my heart just came all the way up into my throat. I was just taken, it was a shocking experience. I was afraid to look. But I told her, I said, the bar exam results are here. And she said, well, we've got to look at them. Go ahead. And so when I opened them, my name was the first name on the list. And did we have a celebration that day? It was wonderful.
What a success.
Yes. And Denton, his son practices law in Bolivar today. And his wife recently died. And now he was typical Southerner in every respect. But he took great joy in helping me prepare for my bar exam. He thought it, and he would never say it publicly, but he thought it was an injustice to require you to take a bar exam and you don't have an opportunity to study for that bar exam. And I had one other disadvantage, and that is Howard University's whole legal curriculum was slanted toward federal law. Well, that came out in the years to come to be a great blessing, but not for a bar exam, because if you hadn't read Carruthers' History of a Lawsuit, I don't think you were going to get very far. And Mr. Denton provided me with his copy of Carruthers' History of a Lawsuit, and I read that day and night.
You moved, after your private practice of law, you moved to become an assistant U.S. attorney with the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Western District of Tennessee. What led you to leave private practice and become part of the U.S. Attorney's Office?
Well, of course, I was looking for any kind of advantage that I could get to advance myself. And at that time, there was a political organization here called the Shelby County Democratic Club. And it was a very, very strong political organization. And Mr. A. Maceo Walker, who was president of Universal Life Insurance Company and Tri-State Bank, was an official in this organization. Mr. Jesse Turner, who was the official who ran the bank, vice president of whatever else down there. And Russell Sugarman, A.W. Willis, Ben Hooks, all these people were very, very strong in the Shelby County Democratic Club. And one morning, out of the blue, Mr. Walker called me. Evie had put a telephone in my office. Nobody ever called me but her, but she wanted me to hear the phone ring once a day. And that would be her. But at any rate, this time, Mr. Walker called me and said, I want you to go down to the downtown across from the Peabody. Go to the second floor. Mayor Orgel is going to meet you there. And he's going to introduce you to Senator Kefauver. Well, I was just so flabbergasted, and he said, now go. And so I did go down there. Sure enough, Mayor Algo was waiting for me on the second floor. And the mayor told me, wait a few minutes and let me tell the senator that you are here. So here I am, mystified by being in the presence of these very prominent people. And then the door opens and he said, walk in. And here's this towering figure of Senator Estes Kefauver. And he made me feel just at home right away. He said, I'm not going to question you. I want to meet you. I want to shake hands with you. And I know where Bolivar is. And his exact words were, any black, any colored, who could come out of Bolivar and do what you've done, I just want to be able to say, I know you. And I want to push this appointment of a black to the United States Attorney's Office, and in effect as a reward for the black political organizations who helped me win. And after that, about 20 minutes, he talked about this, that, and the other. And then he said, you're going to have to get to know Senator Gore. Well, I had never met, this is senior Senator Gore.
Right.
And he said, the way you get to Senator Gore is you've got to know a lawyer named Lucius Birch. Do you know him? No, sir. He said, well, you go on down to his office and we'll call him. And I want you to go and talk with Mr. Birch, and I want you to ask him to help you with Senator Gore. And I did that. And Mr. Birch was very kind, just a wonderful person. And he contacted Senator Gore. And at first, Senator Gore was only in favor of a black assistant who would do research. And he didn't think that a black lawyer would do very well in front of white juries. And he thought research would be the best way to go. So ultimately, I was appointed, did a lot of research, but the day came when I tried cases against Mr. Birch. One was a conversion case where a cattle dealer had sold cattle with a government lien on it. And we went to trial, and the verdict was $35,000. And Mr. Birch started saying hello. And then sometime later, way later, Mr. Birch, I think, had won every civil right, every income tax case he ever tried. He was just a walking terror for the IRS. And the government had indicted a doctor from Dyersburg, a white doctor. And they tried him one time. There was a reversal because the Sixth Circuit apparently felt some error had been made in the trial. Well, the assistant who tried the case did not want to try it twice. He felt like he was going to lose it the second time. And so I was given that case. And Mr. Birch and I went to trial before an all-white jury, mostly women. And when the verdict was read, the foreman said, guilty. And I tell you, you could hear a pin drop. And I couldn't believe it. And he, Mr. Birch, wrote Senator Sasser a letter when I came up for the district courtship. He said, I had always had a very high success with IRS cases. The worst defeat came in a case involving Odell Horton, the assistant United States attorney. I still have that letter today.
Judge, why don't we take a break, and then when we come back, I'd like to hear some more about your years with the U.S. Attorney's Office.
Yes.
Judge Horton, before we took a break, you were telling me about having joined the U.S. Attorney's Office here in the Western District of Tennessee as an assistant U.S. attorney. Am I right in thinking that you were the first black assistant U.S. attorney?
That is correct. And that carried with it many problems. And I think my whole background prepared me well for the job, because initially I was not received very friendly. And it was just felt like, here's somebody here that just really might not serve the government's interests very well. And I got my first furniture was brought up from the basement of the old post office building where the court was located at that time. And Mr. Turner and Mr. Walker were at that time closely tied politically with Attorney General Robert Kennedy. And after Mr. Turner saw what I had, he talked with them, and it was a few days before furniture came that we didn't even need.
This would have been Mr. Jesse Turner?
Yes, Jesse Turner Sr. He's dead now.
Who were the judges that you tried cases before as an assistant U.S. attorney?
Judge Bailey Brown and Judge Marion Boyd. And I tried many cases before Judge Boyd. He had a reputation for being a very strict judge. And after trying cases in his court for about 2 years, he started calling me General. And after that, we got along well. And I tried a lot of cases in Judge Bailey Brown's court. In fact, one of the, the way this got started is, let me back up a little bit. It was not a voluntary thing that I should try a lawsuit. Mr. McTighe, who was an assistant United States attorney, developed cancer on his jaw. And he wasn't able to work full time. And so one morning, the United States attorney called me in about 9:25 and said, we have this case to try this morning. Well, court opened at 9:30. And I hadn't even looked at the file, but it turned out it was a conspiracy case involving 4 or 5 people. And at that time, untaxed liquor cases constituted a big volume of the work in this court. And so I quickly looked at the complaint, which was really the indictment in the case. And then I talked with the agents involved, and I just simply told them, this is the way it is, and you help me, I'll help you, and we'll get this job done. We selected a jury, and on a Monday morning, and at Friday, about midday, the jury came back with a verdict of guilty for everybody.
At that point, were the juries segregated in federal court in Memphis? I don't really remember when that change occurred.
They were mostly white jurors at that time, because one of the cases, I know about 1963 or 64, we tried a case at Jackson. I was given this case to try because it was thought that it would be a loser. And it was a white woman who had been arrested for transporting a great deal of untaxed liquor. And the lawyer was Lloyd Tatum, who later became a judge on I think the Court of Criminal Appeals. He played a role in Walking Tall, the movie. And Tatum said that when he saw who was sent in to try the case and his client with an all-white jury, he just knew this was like shooting fish in a barrel. He told Senator Sasser that. And this lady came in after court opened with a small, well-dressed, very pretty little girl in her arms and sat down. And we tried that case before an all-white jury. They stared at me. There's nothing like getting used to white people staring at you when you are black and doing a particular kind of job, and they would just stare at you. but I would never let staring back me off. And after the jury deliberated, they came back and said guilty, and everybody almost fell out. And Tatum said, you know, I knew then. He said, I told Senator Sass the change had come. And but it was just that kind of thing, and it began to grow. Then we had a very massive explosion case that occurred down in Walls, Mississippi. The government had a contract with this private munitions maker, sort of like the Tune explosion that occurred not long ago. And these people were making these shells, and they are fired from fighter aircraft mostly, and it lights up terrain at night for infantry use. And this was a rather large operation, and government inspectors were on the scene, but they didn't oversee the manufacturing process, but they checked the results. And this lady, who was the initial plaintiff, she said to her supervisor that when she scratched that additional powder from the rim of these casings, she'd noticed there'd be a little pop, and she wondered if that was dangerous. And she said, he told her to go back to work. Well, she was represented by George Morrow. He was a partner in Morrow, Tate, and Morrow. Mm-hmm. And George was a very, very good lawyer, very good lawyer. But I don't think he realized how much time I put on that case, day and night. As the advertisement now says, 24/7. And when I went to his office to take her deposition, he said, go right ahead. We'll treat this as an ordinary thing. So I sort of asked her innocent kinds of questions. And then I asked her about what happened when she scraped the casing with her fingernail, and that was a pop. And she said she thought it was dangerous. Then I asked her, who did you report that to? And she said, I went to my supervisor. And I said, was he a government agent on the premise? Oh, no, he was my supervisor. Mara almost blew up because the case was over. Now, we tried the case before Judge Bailey Brown. It was about 7 days. And Judge Brown ruled in favor of the government. And from that time on, things just sort of began to develop. And it came to pass that I tried a lot of cases, and somehow it was forgotten that I was supposed to be a research assistant. We tried bank robberies, you name it. And there were a lot of cases, and of course a lot of minor cases that involved untaxed liquor, thefts of government checks from the mails, and that sort of thing.
How many other assistant U.S. attorneys were there at that point?
There were 3 of us.
So the other 2 were white?
Yes.
How was their attitude toward you?
Well, after the success of some of the cases began to appear, there was gradually a kind of acceptance. Mm-hmm. And then another thing that we had to do was approve affidavits for federal agents for warrants and that sort of thing. And this was a first field training area for the FBI. And a lot of these young FBI agents would not be quite comfortable with their affidavits. And they had a number 2 man in charge who was a very serious man, Mr. Halter. And so these agents would come to me to review their applications, and it got to the point where they'd almost line up in the hallways, and they didn't want to see anybody but me. And Mr. Robinson changed the procedures. They had to go by his secretary, Ms. Shute, to be assigned an assistant Well, all they did was went back downstairs and called me on the telephone. But we never had an affidavit that failed. We did them right. See, what people didn't know was that there were worlds of transcripts of cases, criminal cases, and I read those transcripts. I read many of those trials, many of them. And so I became comfortable doing what we were doing.
After 5 years or so with the U.S. Attorney's Office, you left, and you've mentioned a minute ago, to work in Mayor Loeb's administration, I believe, with the city of Memphis. Tell us how that came about. Well,
at that time, when there was a change in administrations, the presidency changed, the assistants went with the United States Attorney. One assistant was kept for continuity purposes, and that was usually Ed Vaden. He'd been there a long time. But the rest of us had to look for another job. But at any rate, I was introduced to Mayor Loeb and talked with Mayor Loeb. He told me what they had in mind, and that I would become director of hospitals and health services for the city of Memphis in his administration. And I had heard all of the weird things about Mayor Loeb, many of which were true. But the one thing I found out was that after accepting the job and going to work for him, I never worked for a better person. Never worked for a better person. And he had one classic crisis with me, and that was I had required the hospital authorities to move patients from John Gaston Hospital's wards into the beds in William F. Bowl Hospital, which was kept for the doctors and their private patients. But these people were so deprived that I just thought it was almost inhumane not to do something about a difficult situation. And so I had it done, and it was done. And of course, they took all the telephones out, and I had to go back and tell them to put them back in. Because once they got over there, they started making telephone calls like mad, you know, and I put them back in. Well, the end result is Dr. Andy Holt was president of the University of Tennessee at that time. Dr. Andy Holt, and the UT's got aircraft. And I did not know that Dr. Holt was here in Memphis, in the City Hall, in the mayor's office, with his top staff, and with the deans and the chancellor from the university out there at the medical school. And they had only one request: fire Odell Horton. He's in our way. It's like having an amateur quarterback on a professional football team. And I was called by Mayor Loeb to come down to his office. Well, when I went down and saw all these people, I was astounded. My heart came all the way up to here. And then I learned when Dr. Holt spoke that they were there to ask the mayor to either terminate me there or move me to some other place, but get me out of the hospital system, period. And somehow at first I was extremely nervous. I couldn't help but be. But then for some reason I settled down. And I addressed the mayor, and I told him some of the things that I had seen that were just beyond civilized ways of treating people. For example, there was no private room in which patients could be interviewed. They were just interviewed out there in the open space, because I'd go out there at midnight and just stand and watch. And a lady goes up to a doctor and he said, "What's wrong with you?" And she said, "I'm bleeding." "Where are you bleeding?" And this is all out in front of everybody.
This is at John Gaston
Hospital.
At
old John Gaston Hospital, which was probably symbolic of everything bad about racism in the medical field. And I told them about a nurse out there who was very, very unkind, but she was the supervising nurse. And I told him that the death rate in that emergency room was extremely high, and that when we heard the first draft that consultants had prepared for the hospital, it had that in there. But the final draft did not have that in there. And then I went on to tell him that one of the doctors over there who said that I was like a quarterback on a professional football team, I say his son almost caused a riot out there, and I just happened to be there because he said out loud to a group of other residents and interns, "You should have seen the dogs we admitted here last night." And that was the attitude. And I told him about Mr. Bowl. Mr. Bowl was chairman of the board, William F. Bowl. And one day Mr. Bowl was walking with me, and we were visiting a hospital in various areas. And I told Mr. Bowl, I said, "Why don't you select an office and let's go in and see what happens?" He said, "What do you want to do that for?" I said, "I just want you to show me what happens. I want you to see. Nothing may happen. I'm taking a big risk here." So we went in an office, and there were 5 people sitting there. They paid no attention to us. Didn't recognize him. And finally, he knocked on the counter like that, and he said, "Here, here." And then somebody said, "Can I help you?" And Mr. Bowl became enraged. He said, "I can't believe this is what happens here." And things began to change in a massive way. Well, the end result was Mayor Loeb had me to come over and sit on a couch up in front of him. And then he said, "You know, you all are getting along about like my 2 boys. You don't seem to be able to get along with nothing if it doesn't go your way. And you got to learn how to work together." Well, Dr. Holt was a great storyteller. He'd start telling jokes. He told a joke, I never will forget it, that 2 people in Appalachia was sitting on the front porch, and the wife said to the husband, "You know, you haven't kissed me in years." And he didn't say anything. He just sat there. Then after a few minutes, he got up to go inside the house, and she said, "Well, where are you going?" He said, "I'm going to get my teeth." And everybody roared. And do you know that meeting just fell apart? Fell apart. And I had, after that, the pastor at Second Presbyterian Church was Senator Richard Russell's brother. Dr. Russell came to see me, and he said, "I came to see you because I want you to continue what you're doing, because so much of this affects older people in my church, and you're not wrong." He said, "But now if you ask me to say that out on the street, I'm not going to do it." But I knew we were on our way. And the end result was the whole administrative structure was revamped. A Dr. Johnson was sent here to take over, and ultimately became president of the University of Tennessee. And many, many changes were made for the better. Not all, but many were made for the better. And I got the L.M. Graves Memorial Health Award in 1969 for the person who had done the most to make health care available to large masses of people.
It's quite an honor.
It was.
You mentioned that as you took over this job with the city of Memphis, that the hospital workers went out on strike.
Yes.
What role did you play in that mediating that strike?
I played a direct role as the city's direct representative, advised by Frank Giannotti, who was this city's attorney. We met with him day in and day out, big meetings, little meetings, airport meetings, wherever. And we, over 55 days, we negotiated a settlement which resulted in improvements in the hospital system. For example, black women had to wear a very large vacuum on their backs when they vacuum and clean hallways and that sort of thing, and it was heavy. And I had them to get rid of all those vacuums and get a modern machine that was used everywhere else at the time. And we just made changes like that. And later, one of the doctors asked me if his daughter could be my law clerk, but the position had been filled. And then he said to me, "We knew you were right. You just didn't give us enough time." But I told him, "You had had all this time, and you had done nothing. I don't think you would have gotten there."
Mm-hmm. You were in an unusual situation. Am I correct in thinking that most of the hospital employees were black at that time?
They were.
And there you were representing the city and the white power establishment. Did that put you in a difficult spot?
No, because I could flow easily back and forth, and I did not make race an issue at all, and never have. I don't know how our parents taught us that we shouldn't, but we never did. And so I did not make race an issue. It wasn't a matter of race. It was a question of what's best for this institution and what ought to be done about it. Mm-hmm. For example, if a black woman had a baby at John Gaston Hospital and she did not carry her marriage license with her, the baby would be listed as illegitimate on the birth certificate. That was not fair. How many women think about getting a marriage certificate when you go to have a baby? But that's mm-hmm. typical of the kind of thing that went on there. Mm-hmm. Now, there were threats made. Frank Holloman called me one morning and said, "I don't want you to go to the hospital today. I think there's some people who may hurt you." And he provided police protection for 24 hours a day. The sheriff provided it because at that time I lived outside the city limits. And that went on for 4 or 5 weeks.
Frank Holloman would have been the police chief?
He was director of police, yes. And he didn't take anything lightly. If Frank Holloman undertook a project, he went all the way. Yeah.
Now, you were still working for Mayor Loeb at the time Dr. Martin Luther King was shot, I think.
That is correct.
Tell me a little bit about how
I was not involved with that. I was an observer. And I'm not like those nowadays. I don't think you can find anybody black who was not with Dr. Martin Luther King now. But back in those days, I can tell you there were a lot of people who were not with Dr. King. But I was an observer, and I did not participate as a participant. I participated in representing the city and students.
Were you involved at all in the sanitation workers' strike in
No.
your role with the city?
No. Now, I would hear about it when the mayor had his conferences with all of his staff people. I would hear about what's going on and that sort of thing, but I was not involved in that and didn't want to be.
Shortly after Dr. King was shot, within the next year or so, you took your first stint as a judge, I believe.
That is true. At the end of the year, a vacancy was about to occur in the state criminal court. And I had mentioned to Mr. Charles Black, a lawyer here, that I was interested in becoming a criminal court judge if the vacancy occurred. And he said, "Are you really serious?" And he said, "Yeah." I said, "Yes, sir." Well, he didn't think I meant that, and frankly, I thought that was just one lawyer talking to another going down the street. And out of the blue one morning, he said, "I want you to meet me at the airport. We're going to see the governor." I said, you can't be serious." He said, "I am." So I went to the airport, and we went to see Governor Buford Ellington. And he said, "You know, Governor," they were good friends, very good friends. And they talked about everything but me. And then finally, when it came down to the end, he said, "Governor, I got you a mighty good candidate here for that criminal court job down in Memphis. And I think you ought to consider Odell Horton." And he went and gave some background, having been an assistant U.S. attorney and those sort. And the governor said, "You know, I'll be glad to consider him." But when the appointment was made, it went to Judge Colton, John Colton. And I said, "Well, maybe that's that. We're going with something else." But some weeks later, there was a little item in a column that used to run in the commercial bill called backdrop. And there was a little item in there about the governor filled this position with Judge Colton because they had been in the legislature together and been friends and so forth, but I understood that. And then out of the blue one day, somebody said, the governor's on the phone, he wants to talk with you. Well, people do folk that way, you know, they joke with you. And I said, you got to be joking. They said, sure enough, it is the governor. Sure enough, I answered the phone, wow, sure enough, it is the governor. He said, I'm ready if you are. And the next thing I know, we went through the process, and I became the judge, and I was sworn in over there by Judge Perry Sellers, who was the chief judge. Judge Preston Battle was over there at the time, Beasley and Faquin, I believe. And I went over there and caused a lot of trouble. I went over there, and we had to inspect the jails, and there were people on the floor and all that, and I didn't like what I saw. And I just told them I didn't like that. And I started a pretrial release program. Here in the federal system, it was on recognizance. And I was going to start a recognizance program over there. Well, one day, General Phil Canale came to see me, and he said...
and he would have been the Attorney General?
He was the District Attorney General. And he said, now, if you're going to do this, I would suggest that you call it a dollar bond program, because the officers can handle that, because all they got to do is put $1 rather than 1,000, 500, whatever they've been doing. But they could put in that $1. And it wasn't long before I probably had released, I guess, probably 100 people. I just looked for the right person to start the program with. And I was forever looking, and I couldn't, it looked like it was taking me forever to find the right person, although a lot of people were coming. And one morning, the Lord said to me, there's your candidate. And I looked up, here was this young white man with a young wife and several young children, and they were all there. And he was there on some offense. But the offense could not be a violent offense. It had to be a non-violent offense. And the person had to have connections with the community. And Mr. Mark Luttrell, who ran the penal farm, had Vista volunteers, and he loaned 4 of them to me, and volunteers in service to America. And they did background checks for me because the state did not have any provision for that. And if we verified a job, a home, and things that make people stable in a community. So I released him. And he was my right man all the way. And it wasn't long after that a motorcycle police officer came in and asked me to release his brother-in-law. And I said, you gotta be joking. You fellas have been just literally condemning me. And Frank Holland was making all these speeches about as soon as we lock him up, Horton turns him loose. He said, but Judge, this is my sister's husband. I released him. All of the clamor just died down. It's amazing how things can sink through a community, you know.
It's very interesting because with the assistant, a job that you had as Assistant Attorney General, you were prosecuting crime, and I would think that the prejudice would have been that he's been out here as a prosecutor, he's going to be for the prosecution, and then when you took over the bench, you immediately do something that defense lawyers would have been in favor of.
Yes. Well, I had always operated under the philosophy that I ought to be fair, I ought to be impartial, and that I did not work for the defense, I did not work for the prosecution. My job was to do what was fair and just in every situation. And I did it that way. And I had no regrets. In fact, in all the years that I was associated with the court, the U.S. Attorney and the bankruptcy court and the district court, I can recall only one complaint, somebody from the Board of Professional Responsibility called me and said they had a complaint against me. It grew out of a case involving Sears Roebuck, and somebody in the case involved was named Horton. And the word we get, that person was related to you, and therefore is a conflict of interest. I told them I don't know anything about anything like that. They did an invest. I guess they found out that man was white. I never heard from him again.
Judge, you only served for a year at that time on the bench.
That is true. One morning, Lucius Birch, actually, it was about 20 months, something like that. Lucius Birch and Ben Goodman, who were trustees at Lemoyne College, came over to see me. And they said, we want you to leave the bench and go to Lemoyne and serve as president. Well, I told him, you know, you're asking me to do an awesome. He said, but you're right for what they need right now. And after thinking about it a great deal, talking with Evie about it a great deal, some others, I decided to go. And I did go. And I was there 4 years, and they had 4 of the finest years they've ever had.
Now, you left your position on the bench, I think, had been filled by Dr. Ben Hooks before you...
Ben Hooks filled it first. He was appointed by Governor Frank Clement. And then I succeeded him, being appointed by Governor Ellington, and then Judge Higgs, Otis Higgs, followed me.
Did you take a lot of pressure from the black community giving up a judicial position like that when there were so few blacks on the bench?
No, no. There were too many people happy to see that I might be helpful at Lemoyne, and in fact it turned out I was, because we were able to get the United Church of Christ to do a fundraising drive for what they call the AMA colleges. There are 6 of them, Fisk University, for example, Houston, Tillotson, and Talladega, and some of these others. It raised $9 million. But the point is, so many of these people in charge of the official positions in the church were lawyers. And the president of the church was a lawyer. And he had heard me make a talk at a hotel in New York. And it touched him. And when the church had a synod at Grand Rapids, Michigan, sometime later, he opened his address with my quote. And he sent for me, and he said, I think we're going to go, but I want you to be with me. So I worked with him on his committee with superintendents of the church. These are these geographically divided areas are presided over by superintendents, and they make up his cabinet, basically. And we met in New York, I guess, once every 6 weeks. And he hired a Madison Avenue public relations firm to help us. And the end result was they raised $9 million. Lemoyne got 2.
And that really gave Lemoyne a financial founding that it hadn't had prior to that.
It gave it a kind of security that enabled it to look to the future.
What do you see as the highlight of that 4 or 5 year period where you were president of Lemoyne?
I think it was having an opportunity to associate with people in higher education and to work with them, to learn from them, and get them to see that there's another side to college life other than just teaching. Somebody has to do the business side. And they came to appreciate that. And I came to appreciate that. And through them, I attended, of course, many seminars and lectures, and I was invited to talk with many of these professors and all that, and I became comfortable with it. In fact, President Humphreys, Cecil Humphreys at Memphis State, heard one of these talks. He said, you know, I want you to come out and talk to the Mensa Society at Memphis State. Now, these are the very high IQ people.
Yes, the geniuses.
You know, but I did go out on a Sunday after. What's it called?
They're called geniuses, right? The
Yes,
Mensa Society.
yes.
You have to have an IQ.
They have to take a test and
Yes.
score so high. But I spent an afternoon talking with them, and it turned out to be a very fine And did you know, years later, Dr. Humphrey's son was one of my law clerks.
Cecil, that's right,
Yes.
the year before I clerked for
Yeah.
you. Tell me, during this period, you were also a commentator for one of the local TV stations. What did you talk about?
Well, I was allowed by Mr. Charles Brakefield, who was the president and general manager of WREG at that. It was actually WREC at that time, and he put me on the Saturday night 10 o'clock news, and I could write and comment on any subject that I wished. He had no limitations, but he did have to teach me to hold my head straight, because he said your head bobbles all over the place when you talk. Well, he was one of the kindest people I have ever met, and he later, as you know, contracted cancer. And when I learned that he was ill, I went to Baptist Hospital to visit him. He was surprised to see me, and he said, "Odell, if I was strong enough, I would hug your neck." And I said, "Would it hurt you if I lift you up and we hug each other?" And he said, "No, I will endure that no matter what." I lifted him up. We hugged each other, and we both cried.
Oh, it's very tender.
He was a wonderful man. And you know what he said? "You know, I wrote you a note when you became a federal judge. And do you remember what I said?" And I said, "Yes. These two old boys from Bolivar haven't done too bad, have they?"
What did you comment on, Judge? What
It would
political
be almost
commentary?
any subject. Gardening. I stayed away from controversial subjects. It could be an event that had occurred during the week. It could be on education. It could be on areas in higher education. It could be about the law, because, you know, I had the fortunate experience of having a life in law, in health, and in higher education. So I brought with me that kind of experience. And so he just left it up to me, and it would give me about 4 or 5 minutes airtime. And I became, of course, then widely known, and that set the basis really for me when I ran for Attorney General in 1974.
Tell us about that, because you left Lemoyne, didn't you, in '74 to run
Yes,
for
I
Attorney
stayed
General?
at Lemoyne from 1970 until 1974. And then I had this wild idea of running for Shelby County District Attorney General, which most people thought was just out of the reason. But I did, and I lost that race countywide by somewhere around 4,000 votes. And this was in 1974, and it just couldn't be believed. And Tom Pruitt, a lawyer here named Thomas R. Pruitt, when I retired, he told a group of people over here in the federal building, he said, "You know, if I had not gone on television with Odell, he probably would have won that race."
Who did manage your race? Who was your campaign manager?
A number of people. Mike Cody played a big role in it. Tom Pruitt played a big role in it. Lewis Donaldson was very helpful in it. And there were people that I did not know who were very helpful. And then, of course, Mr. Walker, Mr. Turner, Mr. Sugarman, Mr. Willis, and all these people helped in every way they could. And a lot of preachers helped. Some that said they did more than they did. I have never met anybody yet who did not vote for me, yet I lost by about 4,000 votes.
But you had a lot of support from the white community, mostly Democrats and
That
white
is
community.
correct. And the Press Senator, which is, of course, out of business now, did an analysis of that race, and they showed that 26% of the vote went to Horton. And I put that newspaper analysis in my papers that I had to file with the Senate Judiciary Committee, because one of the questions was, have you ever run for political office?
And that would have been 26% of the white vote?
Yes.
So you worked yourself out of a job.
That's correct.
What did you do?
Well, went through the rigors that you would normally think a person might go through when you lose. But the end result was I one morning said, you know, I've got to do something. And so I remembered that I had worked with an FBI agent named Norman F. Casey on a major stock cotton fraud case. And I went to see him because he at that time headed the Mid-South Medical Center Council. And I told him I was looking for a job. And he said, you wouldn't want a job like this. You've never worked under anybody like this. You've always been in charge. I said, you let me decide that. If I tell you I'll work, I'll work. I'll do the job. And I won't cause you any trouble. So he talked with people on his board, and the end result was that I was hired. I worked there 22 months, and we set up health systems and that sort of thing. One of them is out there. There's a clinic out there that if you go to Grand Junction, it's around near Moscow or beyond LaGrange, somewhere in that area. The Navy provided a trailer, but now it was a building and all that. The doctors who wouldn't serve blacks opposed it and suddenly became very friendly to black patients at that time because they had a place to go. And it worked out fine. So I worked there 22 months, and one morning I got a call from Judge Bailey Brown who said, I'd like to talk with you. And I came up here to the federal building, and they said, we've got what's known as the Speedy Trial Act, and we have to appoint a reporter. And that reporter has to prepare a plan on how we implement the Speedy Trial Act. And this had to do with speeding up the trial of criminal cases, as you know. And much to my surprise, Judge Brown, being the chief judge, put together a committee, the U.S. attorney, the probation officer, the clerk of the court, and all these various people who were involved, and then named me chairman. Well, Tom Turley, the U.S. attorney, said, Your Honor, can't really be serious about that. I don't think you mean to name Horton chairman. He said, I do. And I served as chairman. We developed the plan. It was implemented. And over the years, of course, it's been revised. And after that, Judge Harry Welford recommended me to his colleagues when a vacancy was going to occur in the bankruptcy court. So I went to the bankruptcy court and served in the bankruptcy court from 1976 until 1980 when I became a district court judge.
Judge Brown has always been one of your mentors, hasn't he?
Always, always. He's just been a great fellow, really great fellow.
You mentioned you started out at bankruptcy court in '76, I think. You really had been several years doing a lot of other different things. How did you prepare yourself to take over a role in the bankruptcy court?
By study, intense study. And I also attended all of the seminars that I could, and there were many made available. And, and some of it was learning as you go. Mm-hmm. And I have a philosophy that one can use another person's mind if you go at it right. So I found out that I could use the minds of lawyers, and they would be very helpful to me. And so we had lawyers here, as you well know, who specialize in bankruptcy practice. And instead of telling them what to do, I would suggest that they might want to make some recommendations to the court on how we might go about doing this or that. And it's amazing how it worked. And I did that in the airport case. Part of that case had been in this court for 12, 13 years, and Judge Gibbons asked me to handle it. And when I went to the first meeting, I didn't know there were so many lawyers involved and all these experts and all these maps and that sort of thing. And I told them, I'm not going to court until we have to have a public hearing. We're going to work this out. But I want you to come up with an agenda for me on every meeting. It worked. And I read in the newspaper not long ago that about 60% of the people have been paid. Now, this part of it had to do with abrogation. It didn't have to do with property. It had to do with the right of airplanes to fly over the property and homes of people, and they were being paid X dollars in compensation for the inconvenience of having these aircraft come in over their homes. So they call it abrogation rights.
I didn't know that word. This is a case you handled recently as a retired federal judge.
Right.
How were you treated? There were a couple of other bankruptcy judges at the time you became a bankruptcy judge, I believe.
Well, Judge Leffler was here at that time, and he was on the other end of the building. I was on this end of the building, and we had our separate dockets and all that. But as you know, Judge Leffler was a very congenial person, and I never had any difficulty with him.
Tell me how you made the transition then from bankruptcy court to the U.S. District Court.
With great joy. I was in the bankruptcy court one morning, and I got a telephone call that Senator Sasser wanted me to come to Washington, and that all the arrangements had been made, and that I should not tell anyone, just leave. So I told the lawyers I had to adjourn, but I did go by to see Judge Bailey Brown, and I asked him for his advice, what, if anything, he would advise me. He said, well, I think that if you would be sure you're in full support of the government and that you will do your job right, that ought to do it. So I went to Washington and met with Senator Sasser, and he did something I never had anybody else do. We had chairs like these chairs, and he said, I want you to pull your chair up to mine. And I said, well, I was a little uncomfortable, and he said, yeah, pull it up to mine. And we came up to where we were almost nose to nose. And he said, look me in the eye, and I did. And he said, I want you to promise me that you will stay there and that you will do this job if I recommend you. And I assured him that I would. And for a few minutes, it was just staring in silence. And then he said, okay, thank you. And then the rest is history.
Had you applied?
But I did stay. I did do the job.
Yes, you did.
I stayed with it all the time. People were not always happy, but I did the job. One of the things that caused great difficulty was the coming of the proliferation of drugs. And the then United States Attorney, I think he took every drug case that ever walked the streets of Memphis, however small, however large. It didn't make any difference, because I sometimes would have jurors ask me, why would these Graham cases on drugs be tried in federal court? But I said, well, it's not up to us to decide what cases come here. We can only try those cases, and we have a very limited jurisdiction to dismiss those cases. And one is a lack of evidence, and the other is prosecutorial misconduct. If you didn't have that, you had to try the case. Mm-hmm. So that really bogged down the court and put the civil cases, as you may recall, in a position where they just stacked up because there were so many criminal cases we had to give preference to.
That's true. Had you applied, let's go back to the confirmation process a minute, because that, I have a feeling, is much different today than it was then. Had you applied for the position or as district court?
No, I was never given an application to fill out. One Saturday morning, an FBI agent came and called on me, and his name was Lawrence. And he said, are you Odell Horton? Yes, sir. He said, can I come in? Yes. He had a zipper bag in his pocket I had down over his eyes, and he fit the profile in my mind of an FBI agent, somebody you really just would prefer not to deal with. But he came in, he was very nice, and I said, but I don't have an application. And he said, I have it with me. And it was he who gave me the application, and I filled it out.
How do you think that got initiated? What happened behind the scenes?
I think it came through pushed by Mr. Walker and Mr. Turner, in touch with Attorney General Robert Kennedy.
And that would have been Maceo Walker and Jesse Turner?
That is correct.
So it was really their strength in the local Democratic Party and their ties?
It was very, very powerful at that time. It has splintered a lot since then, but at that time it was a very powerful political entity.
It's fascinating to me to think that they locally had a direct link to Robert Kennedy.
However it was established, it was there. They also had a friendly connection with Mr. Siegenthaler, a publisher of the Tennessean. And he knew something about these things that went on down here just like these other people did. So how it was connected and all of that, no one ever told me. I never knew. I was simply told, you must do this job well. We're depending on you. And the thing that I can look back and with great satisfaction is that Ben Hooks and I did the job so well that it convinced white people, I think, that a black judge could be fair and impartial. And I think Higgs came along and added to that. Now, I can tell you a story. One of General Canale's assistants, who is dead now, came to me and said, "Now, look, we like to work over here. We don't play. We like to work." I said, "Fine," because I had just come out of the Loeb group. My Lord, if you work for Henry Loeb, he may call you at midnight and say, "Can you be at the meeting at the airport at 7 tomorrow morning?" You know, he'd call you 5:30 in the morning. So, "What are you going to be doing today?" You know, he was just that way. He's a telephone man. And I told him, fine. And we went to work on criminal cases in that court. There was one time I had 3 juries out deliberating at one time and had some other folk researching whether we could try cases on Sunday or not. So after about 3 months, General Canale came to me and said, "My people are tired. They need a rest." I said, "General, send in some more people. You got a man here who said that we work over here and we want to get a job done. And I don't want anybody to ever say that this colored judge came over here and did not do his job." And after that, things settled down, and it just went great. And of course, General Canale was a gentleman all the way. He was really great.
Judge, we need to take a break to change the tape.
Okay.